August 1945. The war room beneath the Imperial Palace was a space that never slept. 90 feet below the earth, where thick concrete kept out the noise of sirens and the scent of burning cities, Japan's last generals clung to the illusion of control. Maps hung like fading prayers across the walls, red and blue markers pushed daily by hands that trembled less from exhaustion than from denial. Every morning began the same. Reports of lost ground, fuel shortages, supply convoys cut apart by submarines. Field Marshal Shinroku Hada's briefings had become less about strategy and more about maintaining the ritual of authority. If the room still moved, if the lights still burned, perhaps the empire had not yet fallen. At precisely 08:15, that illusion fractured. Lieutenant Colonel Tishi Yamamoto, the communications officer known for his discipline, burst through the steel door without the bow expected of a man entering the presence of his superiors. His boots echoed against the floor as he clutched a slip of paper in both hands. A decoded transmission from Hiroshima. The officers turned, ready to scold the breach of etiquette, until they saw the color leave his face. Yamamoto's voice shook as he read the message aloud. Entire city destroyed by single bomb. Blast radius exceeds all previous bombardment. Unknown weapon type. Casualties, catastrophic. Request immediate. He stopped. The sentence ended there, mid-word, as if the rest had been burned away. For a long moment, no one spoke. The hum of ventilation filled the silence, a hollow rhythm against disbelief. General Yoshiro Umezu, chief of the Imperial General Staff, reached for the telegram and read it again. Once, twice, a third time. His mind tried to fold it into something familiar. Perhaps a massive conventional strike, he thought. 500 bombers. 1,000. Incendiaries layered upon explosives until the city had simply vanished beneath fire and pressure. Anything but what the words implied, but the arithmetic refused to cooperate. Reconnaissance reported only 3 aircraft over Hiroshima that morning. 3? Not squadrons, not waves, just a trio of silver specks crossing a clear blue sky. The rest of the fleet had been grounded by weather. It made no sense. No weapon in existence could erase an entire city with so little. Around the table, the men who had guided Japan through years of conflict exchanged glances that spoke louder than their titles. Admiral Suimu Toyota stepped toward the map on the wall, tracing the Pacific with his finger. Every red pin represented American strength. Ships, carriers, bombers, an ocean of steel that had expanded faster than Japan's ability to comprehend. His staff had spent years charting these patterns, turning data into predictions, finding comfort in mathematics. But now, the data no longer fit the equation. At 10 Sioux hours, reports from reconnaissance pilots deepened the unease. They described a vertical cloud unlike any in memory, rising 40,000 feet, glowing with colors that pulse like molten metal. It shimmered in purples and oranges visible from more than 100 miles away. The radio officer's hand trembled as he repeated the description. The generals looked up as if the very ceiling above them might begin to glow. By 11:30, a railway official who had been 15 miles from Hiroshima sent a first-hand account. He spoke of a flash brighter than anything the human eye should see, followed by a wave of air that tore train cars from their tracks. When he turned toward the city, it was gone, replaced by a moving wall of fire that devoured everything in its path. His voice on the wire cracked. The recording stopped. The afternoon meeting of the Supreme War Council began in silence. Prime Minister Kantaro Suzuki sat with the report spread before him, his fingers tracing the edges of the paper as if to test whether the documents were real. Around him, the architects of Japan's military destiny waited for someone to speak the first word of disbelief. Suzuki lifted his eyes. "Gentlemen," he said quietly, "we must consider what this means." General Korochika Anami, the Minister of War, answered first, his tone steady but his knuckles white. "American deception. They want us to think they have a weapon they do not possess. Hiroshima was hit by conventional bombing, nothing more. 3 aircraft cannot destroy a city." Admiral Toyota interrupted. Something unthinkable in such a council. 3 aircraft, Anami-san. Our radar tracked them. Our observers saw them. There were 3. The words hung in the air like an aftershock. No one spoke again. The room felt smaller, the ceiling lower, as if the weight of the truth had pressed the bunker deeper into the earth. For years, they had told themselves that numbers could be overcome by spirit, that courage could equal machinery. Yet here was proof that numbers had found a way to rewrite the laws of war entirely. Umezu set the telegram on the table and stared at it as though the paper itself might offer a different answer. The hum of the lights returned, steady, mechanical, American, perhaps, in its reliability. He realized then what the message truly said. It wasn't just about Hiroshima. It was about everything they had believed since the first day of the war. If a single message could not be true, then the instruments must be lying. The pilots must be lying. The witnesses must be lying. Or, far worse, everything they had ever believed about how wars are won had just collapsed in the space of a single minute. The disbelief spread outward like ripples from a stone dropped into still water. At first, the staff officers clung to the familiar, the idea of an error in the instruments, a misread in the weather reports, an exaggeration by panicked witnesses. Yet each incoming transmission stripped away another layer of denial. The radar logs from Western Honshu confirmed it with cruel precision. 3 aircraft had passed through their network, not a single one more. The blips had appeared, climbed, released, and disappeared eastward into the clouds. There had been no formation, no escort, no swarm of bombers, just 3 solitary echoes on a green screen that now seemed to whisper of something beyond calculation. The weather observer's notes followed. Clear skies, visibility exceptional, low wind. They had watched the aircraft glint in the morning light and counted seconds between flashes and impact, assuming, as always, that more would follow. None had. Minutes later, the horizon had erupted. Pilots from nearby airfields, sent to investigate the glow, radioed descriptions that strained belief. A column of smoke rising straight up, colored not in gray or black, but in a kind of furious violet, a shimmering orange core that seemed alive. It climbed beyond any known altitude, blooming into a shape that twisted like a living thing. The oldest observer among them, a man who had seen Mount Osama's eruption decades before, said it was like watching the earth reverse itself, fire ascending instead of descending. At 11 CU, a reconnaissance plane attempted to reach the city. The pilot's voice over the radio broke as he described the turbulence. His aircraft jolted upward thousands of feet, as if thrown by an invisible hand. Heat readings surged beyond the limits of his instruments. "The city is gone," he said finally. "There is only light and dust." Static consumed his next words. By noon, the first fragments of civilian testimony arrived, carried by survivors who had been far enough from the center to live yet close enough to see what no one should see. One spoke of a blinding white burst that erased the world's sound for several seconds, followed by a roar that felt as if the sky itself had cracked. Another described houses vanishing, not burning or collapsing, but dissolving into air, and then the silence, the kind that leaves the ear searching for something to fill it. Inside the war room, the generals listened in stillness. A single statement now defined the day. 3 aircraft, 1 city. They had spent years convincing themselves that America's strength was mechanical, soulless, and predictable. Machines could be matched by courage, ships by sacrifice, numbers by will. But this could not be answered with spirit. There was no countermeasure for something that turned matter itself into ash. Admiral Toyota leaned over the operations map, tracing the faint blue lines of American bomber routes. His finger stopped over Hiroshima. 3 aircraft, he murmured again, as if repetition might make it smaller. He glanced at Umezu, who still stared at the telegram on the table, and at Anami, whose silence now felt heavier than his words had ever been. Around them, the young aides avoided meeting anyone's eyes. The sound of a single clock tick filled the room like a heartbeat. The council had been trained to interpret silence as respect, but this silence carried something different. It was the hush that follows the first tremor before the ground truly moves, the kind of quiet that makes even believers doubt. In that stillness, a thought neither recorded nor spoken crossed every mind present. Perhaps the war they thought they were fighting no longer existed. For years before the telegram from Hiroshima, Japan's war machine had been powered not just by fuel or metal, but by conviction, an intricate architecture of belief so strong that even arithmetic seemed to obey it. The generals had built their doctrine on 3 pillars, and each had appeared unshakable. The first was distance, the idea that the Pacific itself would serve as a weapon. Every mile between Japan and America was thought to be an ally, a vast stretch of ocean that would drown the enemy's logistics long before they reached Japanese shores. The empire's conquests were designed as a defensive labyrinth, rings of occupied islands and captured ports that would bleed American supply lines dry. Ships, aircraft, even bullets would have to cross thousands of miles before they could harm the homeland. It was elegant on paper and suicidal in practice. The second pillar was morale. Japan's leadership convinced itself that America was too soft to fight a long war. In their secret briefings, American society was described as indulgent, fractured, dependent on comfort. A nation of individualists, they said, incapable of enduring mass sacrifice. The calculation was chillingly specific. Once 30 or 40,000 American casualties filled their newspapers, public outrage would force the White House to negotiate. The Japanese soldiers' willingness to die would outlast the American voters' patience. It was less a strategy than a cultural mirror, projecting what Japan feared about itself onto its enemy and mistaking the reflection for prophecy. The third pillar was tactical superiority, the unshakable faith that one Japanese soldier was worth 3 Americans. That skill and discipline could neutralize industry and numbers. The Army's manuals spoke of the warrior's spirit as a weapon unto itself, sharper than steel, stronger than engines. From the jungles of Malaya to the decks of carriers, they fought as if courage could alter production ratios. Each defeat was treated not as proof of the doctrine's collapse, but as evidence that they hadn't believed in it hard enough. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto had been the first to see the flaw. Long before the war began, he had studied at Harvard, walked the factories of Chicago and Detroit, and watched American production lines turn out in minutes what Japan needed days to make. His warnings were precise, mathematical, and largely ignored. "I can run wild for 6 months," he had told his peers, "but I have no confidence after that." They mistook humility for defeatism, pragmatism for lack of faith. Yamamoto had seen the future in conveyor belts and oil reserves. His colleagues saw only the poetry of sacrifice. Each disaster that followed was swallowed by the same reflex of denial. When Midway erased 4 carriers in a single day, the official reports blamed bad luck, shifting winds, and faulty reconnaissance. When Guadalcanal devoured divisions of men in a grinding stalemate, Tokyo declared the failure a matter of weak local leadership. The doctrine was never wrong. It merely needed better execution, purer spirit, more death. Even as factories fell silent for lack of raw materials, the war room's maps remained filled with arrows pointing outward, as though intent could replace fuel. By 1945, the Empire's commanders were surrounded by numbers that no longer aligned with their story. Tonnage lost, pilots trained, fuel remaining, steel output, every metric screamed collapse, but the ideology demanded triumph. In this room beneath the palace, arithmetic had always been obedient, its harsh edges sanded smooth by slogans and ceremony. Yet, as the reports from Hiroshima spread, the figures began to rebel. For the first time, the men reading them could feel the numbers turning against them, stripping away their myths one calculation at a time. If the story was wrong, then numbers would be the first to mutiny, and they had just declared their revolt. Colonel Hideaki Sato had always trusted numbers. They didn't waver under pressure or salute illusions. They simply waited for someone brave enough to read them aloud. His intelligence team had spent the entire war charting the impossible slope of American production, the way the graphs rose like tidal waves, each crest higher than the last. They had counted tanks, carriers, bombers, shells, and ships, turning columns of ink into quiet warnings. But on August 6th, as the war room filled with reports from Hiroshima, Sato realized that even mathematics had become inadequate. He opened his notebook anyway, as if ritual might still matter. Since 1941, he began, the United States has produced 88,000 tanks. He paused, let the number hang in the air. We have built 6,450. His voice stayed calm, factual, almost gentle. They launched 41 aircraft carriers. We launched 15. He turned another page. Their shipyards construct cargo vessels faster than our submarines can sink them. Their ammunition factories produce in 1 week what our factories make in a month. No one interrupted. The rhythm of the figures was hypnotic, a kind of slow confession measured in tons of steel and gallons of fuel. But none of this, Sato continued, explains what we witnessed in Hiroshima. He lifted his eyes for the first time. If a single bomb can erase a city, then production numbers no longer define power. We are counting horses in an age of thunder. He unfolded another sheet, stamped with the red seal of the Army Research Bureau. It listed personnel counts in American scientific facilities: physicists, engineers, chemists, technicians. Our entire scientific establishment numbers 6,000, he said. Their equivalent, 130,000. A whisper moved through the room like a draft. The figure seemed absurd, a typo of civilization. But Sato continued, detailing laboratories hidden inside entire American cities: Oak Ridge, Hanford, Los Alamos, places that had consumed more electricity than Tokyo itself. They have been building weapons in secret while fighting wars on 2 oceans. Their science has no equivalent in our system. It is not an extension of their army. It is their army. He let the ledger close with a quiet thud. Around him, the men stared not at him, but through him, as though the walls themselves had begun to dissolve. For years they had taken comfort in ratios. How many ships to lose before balance was restored? How many planes to sacrifice for one victory? Ratios implied symmetry, the illusion that war was still a contest played by the same rules. But the bomb had made the arithmetic predatory. When one explosion could equal 10,000 raids, counting holes and pilots was no longer strategy. It was nostalgia. Foreign Minister Togo spoke next, his tone almost reverent. If they have one such bomb, he said slowly, we must assume they have more. The words landed with the finality of a verdict. Even the optimists didn't argue. In the space of a day, war had shifted from numbers to comprehension, from totals to thresholds. For Sato, the realization was personal. He had spent 4 years trying to warn his superiors that America's strength wasn't its courage, but its capacity to make courage exponential, to give ideas physical form faster than anyone else could dream them. Now he understood the true scale of that multiplication. The Americans hadn't simply built a weapon. They had industrialized invention itself. The silence that followed was different from fear. It was the quiet of men who understood that their world had already ended, even if the calendar refused to admit it. And then the photographs arrived, making arithmetic feel like mercy. The first photographs reached Tokyo just before midday on August 7th, still wet from development, their edges curling under the heat of the darkroom lamps. The courier carried them through the palace corridors without a word, his uniform smeared with ash from the airfield where he'd landed. They passed from hand to hand in the bunker, each print releasing a silence deeper than the one before it. No one needed an explanation. The images spoke a language beyond debate. The reconnaissance flight that had captured them nearly didn't return. Major Kitamura, the pilot, had entered the skies over Hiroshima expecting turbulence. What he found defied aerodynamics. The air itself seemed alive. Updrafts slammed his aircraft upward thousands of feet in seconds, spinning his instruments, rattling every bolt in the frame. He described the feeling as flying through the breath of a furnace, heat so intense the paint blistered on the wings. Through gaps in the smoke, he saw nothing recognizable, no landmarks, no pattern of streets, only a vast circular scar where a city had once existed. When the photographs emerged, the generals could barely orient themselves. The familiar geography of Hiroshima, the bridges, the castle, the river deltas, was gone. In their place lay a flattened expanse, 4 square miles of nothing. The earth scraped bare as if creation itself had been reversed. Even the shadows of buildings had vanished, replaced by outlines burned into the ground like fossilized light. Analysts compared the images to the Tokyo firebombing of March that same year. 334 bombers, over 3 hours, 1,600 tons of incendiaries. That had been destruction by exhaustion, the culmination of planning and manpower. Hiroshima was the same result distilled into a heartbeat. Umezu studied the photographs longer than anyone else. He traced his finger along the edge of the blast radius and whispered, "It looks clean." The comment was not admiration, but horror, the kind born of seeing power stripped of effort, devastation delivered without struggle. To men who had spent years equating sacrifice with consequence, the idea of annihilation achieved in silence felt inhuman. Sato stood behind him, watching the thin sheets of paper curl in the lamplight. For all his numbers and ledgers, for all the equations he had trusted, none of it could express what these images made visible. There was no variable for vaporized stone, no ratio for human absence. This, he said quietly, is what the end of arithmetic looks like. Outside, the day continued with eerie calm. Tokyo's air raid sirens remained silent. The sky was empty. Yet in the war room, the weight of that single morning pressed down heavier than all the bombs dropped in 4 years. The photographs circulated through the ministries like contraband truths. Every officer who saw them felt the same creeping certainty. Nothing about this war was calculable anymore. And then, just as the last photograph was laid flat on the conference table, another telegram arrived, its seal foreign, its timing merciless. It had crossed a border overnight, carrying a message that would erase Japan's final illusion of negotiation and hope. The telegram came at dawn, hand-delivered by a trembling courier from the foreign ministry. Its sender was unmistakable, Moscow. For months, Japanese diplomats had whispered a single fragile hope through neutral embassies, that Stalin might act as a bridge between Japan and the Allies, negotiating terms before the empire was crushed entirely. The illusion had been convenient, even comforting. Now, with one short message, it disintegrated. At midnight, Moscow time, Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov had summoned Ambassador Naotake Sato to the Kremlin. His tone was formal, almost polite, as he read the statement. The Soviet Union will consider itself at war with Japan, effective August 9, 1945. There were no theatrics, no threats, just the cold efficiency of inevitability. The cable's arrival in Tokyo felt like the sound of a locked door. In the bunker, the council gathered again. Admiral Toyota unfolded a fresh map across the table. The paper still creased from disuse. The northern perimeter, Manchuria, Korea, Sakhalin, was supposed to be secure, protected by terrain and treaty. Now, red arrows began crawling across it like veins of fire. Soviet armor had already crossed the border in force, moving at speeds Japanese commanders had once deemed impossible. The Kwantung Army, once the pride of the empire, was collapsing within hours. Columns of Soviet tanks advanced 50 miles a day. Supported by aircraft Japan couldn't track, and radio coordination they couldn't jam. The most humiliating detail came from the intelligence annex. Those Soviet forces were driving American trucks, communicating through American radios, supplied by American fuel. The Lend-Lease program, dismissed by Japanese analysts as Western extravagance, had turned the Soviet offensive into a moving proof of American production power. The very industry that had built the bomb was now rolling toward Japan on 4 wheels, speaking Russian through American steel. General Umezu gripped the edge of the table, staring at the map as though it were bleeding. "We are surrounded by their factories," he murmured. "They fight us through others while they build weapons we cannot even see." The realization settled like ash in every corner of the room. America's power wasn't just in the Pacific sky, it was global, networked, multiplied through allies who now advanced from every direction. The empire that had once dreamed of encircling its enemies had been outproduced, outplanned, and outmaneuvered by a nation that could fight 2 wars and invent a new one at the same time. Foreign Minister Togo spoke next, his voice stripped of rhetoric. "We have 3 choices," he said. "Surrender unconditionally, fight until each city is erased as Hiroshima was, or resist until the Soviets and Americans meet upon our soil and Japan ceases to exist." No one argued. Even the hardliners had run out of vocabulary to disguise defeat. The room fell quiet again, the kind of silence that comes when strategy no longer applies. The sound of distant typing from the communications desk was the only movement left. Messages going out into a world that had already decided Japan's fate. Above ground, Tokyo was still untouched that morning, but every man in the war room knew it was only a matter of time. They had seen what one bomb could do. And as they stared at the map now closing in on all sides, a single, unbearable thought echoed in every mind. If one bomb can end a city, what happens when a second one falls And on whom? The second strike came like a grim punctuation mark. Another city erased in a single instant. Another transmission that ended mid-sentence. At 11:02, the radio fell quiet in the same way it had the day before, briefly, then forever. Men who had spent years rehearsing responses to raids found their procedures useless. Anti-air batteries that could shatter formations at distance had no sensor for what happened before the flash. Fighter patrols could not intercept what left no trail to follow. Civil defense plans meant to shepherd populations into shelters were reduced to gestures against a force that did not give warning. The old playbook, written for an era of iron and ordnance, had a blind spot where this new reality began. In the bunker, voices that had argued doctrine for decades became small and careful. Umezu, who had held the maps and men together through setbacks and denials, spoke aloud a truth that had been whispered in private until that moment. Concentrating forces in cities or staging areas made them targets in a way that invasion never had. The strategy that assumed an enemy must land to impose terms was suddenly obsolete. Destruction could be administered at a distance with no need for boots, flags, or occupation. To argue for fighting on until foreign boots crossed the home islands was to ask a nation to trade its towns for honor, a bargain some officers now refused to take on behalf of civilians. This realization reshaped every debate. For isolationists and hardliners, the prospect of an invasion had been the last line of defense for pride. It allowed sacrifice to be framed as delay. Yet, if the enemy could eliminate urban life without landing, that last line vanished. Tactical concentration, once a source of strength, gathering troops to repel landings, centralizing command and supplies, had become vulnerability. The calculus of attrition was meaningless when the threshold for obliteration required no assault at all. What remained then was not a battlefield in the traditional sense, but an arena of diplomacy and perception. Messages, ambiguity, and the framing of surrender would determine more than any regiment or fleet. The emperor's position, the preservation of institutions, and the face-saving language acceptable to domestic audiences and foreign commanders suddenly became instruments as lethal as any weapon. Negotiation was no longer mere politics. It was survival strategy writ large. When the physical map that once guided strategy dissolved, the only terrain left to contest was political. And politics in that moment revealed itself to be the cruelest landscape of all, full of clauses, ambiguities, and the painful arithmetic of what a nation could bear to lose and what it could not. By August 10th, the war room had become less a command center than a courtroom, with every man inside silently preparing his defense against history. The telegram drafted that morning was Japan's final plea to the world, a conditional surrender transmitted through neutral Swiss channels. The offer was simple in phrasing but desperate in meaning. Japan would accept the Potsdam Declaration, provided the emperor's sovereignty remained untouched. It was an attempt to preserve at least one thread of dignity from the unraveling fabric of empire. 2 days later, the reply arrived. It was brief, deliberately ambiguous, and read like something written with a diplomat's scalpel. The emperor would be subject to the supreme commander of the Allied powers, it said, but his ultimate status would depend on the freely expressed will of the Japanese people. The sentence was crafted to be unreadable in only one way, comforting enough for peace, insulting enough for defiance. And it worked. The council split instantly. On one side stood the men who still believed in honor through ruin, General Anami and his circle, soldiers to the end, insisting that surrender would desecrate every life already given. They argued that Japan must continue the fight even if every city vanished, that the true essence of the nation existed in spirit, not soil. On the other side, a smaller, quieter group led by Foreign Minister Togo and Admiral Yonai argued for survival over symbolism. To them, preservation of the emperor meant preservation of Japan itself, even if that survival came cloaked in humiliation. The debate went in circles, looping back on pride and pain, the air thick with the ghosts of unspoken admissions. No one dared utter the obvious, that the war had been lost years before, in boardrooms where arithmetic had been replaced with faith. Now, as those same men circled the wreckage of their decisions, surrender felt less like an act of submission, and more like the first truthful thing they had done in years. It was late in the evening when the emperor's private secretary entered the chamber. He carried no telegram, no military brief, only a single sheet of paper with His Majesty's handwritten words. The Emperor had broken with precedent and spoken his will directly. The unendurable must be endured. The sentence landed like a verdict. No one moved for several seconds. The meaning was unmistakable. The war was to end, not through victory or defiance, but through acceptance of the impossible. Anyami bowed his head, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement. For the first time in the war, the divine figure they had sworn to protect was leading them away from death instead of toward it. Outside, in the stillness of the palace grounds, the sound of cicadas carried through the humid air. Inside, pens scratched across documents that would travel through embassies, cables, and radio waves until they reached the desks of men who had never seen the ruins of Hiroshima or Nagasaki. The machinery of surrender had begun to move, but in that bunker, no one felt relief, only the weight of realization. Signing a paper would be easy. Confronting what they had misjudged would not. And soon, the proof of that misjudgment would glide into Tokyo Bay, gray, vast, and armored, a floating monument to the civilization they had refused to understand. September the 2nd, 1945. Tokyo Bay lay still under a pale sky, the air heavy with humidity, and the strange quiet that follows when history pauses to sign its own ending. The bay, once patrolled by Japanese destroyers, was now a floating continent of steel. Hundreds of American warships stretched to the horizon, their hulls painted with numbers that seemed to mock arithmetic itself. Above them, squadrons of aircraft circled in layered formations so vast that the sun flickered in and out behind their wings. The war had ended, but its lesson had arranged itself into a tableau designed for comprehension. At the center of it all was a single ship, the USS Missouri, gray and monumental, moored like an altar in a cathedral of iron. The Japanese delegation approached in silence. Their shoes clicked against the deck, polished to mirror finish, reflecting faces drawn by exhaustion and disbelief. They passed rows of sailors standing rigid at attention, every uniform a statement of order that contrasted brutally with the chaos Japan had lived through. Foreign Minister Mamoru Shigemitsu, cane in hand, limped forward to sign the instrument of surrender. Beside him, General Yoshijiro Umezu represented what remained of the Imperial General Staff. When his pen touched paper, he noticed his reflection in the document's glossy surface, a man dwarfed by the machinery around him. Later, he would write in his diary, "We surrendered aboard a ship they built in less time than it took us to plan a single operation." The Missouri had been laid down, launched, and armed while Japan debated strategies already made irrelevant by American production speed. As the delegation turned to leave, Shigemitsu allowed himself a single glance across the harbor. What he saw was not a fleet, it was an ecosystem. Cargo ships offloading supplies for hundreds of thousands of troops, cranes swinging crates of food, medicine, vehicles. Trucks rolled down ramps and lined the docks in neat rows, ready to deliver fresh rations to men who had crossed the Pacific without losing appetite or morale. In that moment, Japan's leaders saw the true nature of the enemy they had imagined as soft and divided. America had not chosen between guns and butter. It had manufactured both as if they were the same product line. Within weeks, occupation forces spread through the country like an industrial tide. Japanese officers recorded every detail with a mix of awe and disbelief. One American infantry division moved with more motor transport than the entire Japanese army had owned. Their field hospitals resembled miniature cities, lit, sterilized, and stocked with medicines that Japan's surgeons had only read about. Their supply chains functioned like arteries, never clogged, never starving. Trucks delivered hot food where Japanese troops had eaten roots. Even in defeat, the Americans behaved as though abundance were a reflex, not a privilege. Colonel Sato, whose numbers had haunted the war room, was assigned to compile a final report for the occupation administration. He titled it, "Why We Lost." In its pages, he abandoned rhetoric entirely. "We lost," he wrote, "in December 1941, when we attacked an enemy we did not understand." Every figure he had ever presented, tanks, planes, fuel, scientists, became footnotes to a single conclusion. America's strength had never been its weapons, but its system, its ability to turn imagination into infrastructure, to make knowledge reproducible, to scale invention faster than ideology could react. Former Prime Minister Suzuki, interviewed by American historians, phrased it with a kind of stunned respect. "We thought we fought merchants," he said. "We fought manufacturers of civilization." For him, the most devastating realization was not that Japan had been destroyed by a bomb, but that it had been undone by a mindset, a culture that treated creation and destruction as two halves of the same machine. As occupation life unfolded, the symbols of defeat became daily lessons. Power stations restored light to Tokyo using American equipment. Trains ran on fuel Japan had never been able to refine. Radios played foreign broadcasts while American engineers taught Japanese technicians how to maintain them. The conquerors didn't just occupy land, they reconnected a nation to the modern world, showing, unintentionally, that victory wasn't an act of dominance, but of production. Sato's final line in Why We Lost read, "We believed courage could overcome capacity. We believed faith could outbuild factories. We believed wrong." His report ended not with despair, but with a kind of clarity that only ruins could provide. The ceremony aboard Missouri had ended in minutes, but its meaning lingered far longer. The generals had signed not just a surrender, but a confession to their own blindness. For years, they had stared at ledgers filled with numbers too large to believe, convinced that morale could outshout mathematics. The war had ended when the numbers spoke louder. The final chapter of this story was never about bombs. It was about beliefs. The comforting lies that led men to ignore the ledger in front of them, and the cold truth that arithmetic, once carnivorous, always finishes its meal. By the time occupation officials began their interviews in 1947, the transformation inside Japan's surviving leadership was complete. The men who had once spoken of honor and purity now used words like process, capacity, and systems. They had spent years insisting that democracy made nations indecisive, that diversity fractured unity, that wealth softened resolve. Now they understood that each of those traits, democracy, diversity, prosperity, had been the hidden engines of the enemy's strength. America's freedom to argue had produced innovation. Its social mixture had concentrated talent. Its wealth had not bred weakness, but resilience. The ability to sustain both comfort and conflict without losing either. When they learned the scale of the Manhattan Project, the realization became almost spiritual. The United States had built a secret network of cities that functioned as a mirror of what Japan could never imagine. Los Alamos, Oak Ridge, Hanford, entire populations organized around one idea, producing a weapon of physics and philosophy combined. 130,000 workers, scientists, and engineers, more than Japan's total number of trained researchers, a project that consumed more electricity than Tokyo, cost more than Japan's entire 1944 military budget, and remained invisible until it was finished. To Japanese scientists who saw the first post-war technical documents, the revelation felt like finding out their opponent had been fighting with a new law of nature. Admiral Toyota wrote in his 1946 testimony, "We believed democracy meant disorder, but it meant a competition of ideas, and that made them faster. We believed diversity meant weakness, but it meant they had every kind of mind, every skill. We believed wealth meant indulgence, but it meant they could afford to think longer than we could fight." What they once mocked as chaos was, in truth, an engine of coordination far beyond any command hierarchy. Yamamoto's old warning, 6 months of success, no confidence after the first year, returned to haunt every post-war reflection. He had not been predicting defeat. He had been describing inevitability. His 6 months were the span before mathematics overtook myth, before chemistry and steel rendered courage ornamental. Every bomb that fell, every ship that launched, every radio frequency intercepted had been a data point in a problem Japan refused to solve. That belief cannot outbuild infrastructure. Colonel Sato, who had written Why We Lost, became almost philosophical in his final reports to occupation analysts. "We fought as though the modern world were optional," he wrote. "They fought as though it were the only world that mattered." To him, Hiroshima and Nagasaki were not symbols of cruelty, but of inevitability, the visible form of a civilization that had learned to turn knowledge into energy. The tragedy was not that Japan faced superior weapons. It was that it had spent decades cultivating reverence instead of research, loyalty instead of laboratories. In this inversion of everything they had believed, courage became pathos, spirit became waste, and honor turned into an epitaph for misunderstanding. They saw, too late, that courage without chemistry is tragedy. Spirit without steel is surrender written in advance. The war's ending was not just the silencing of guns. It was the moment when illusion exhausted itself, and reality resumed its slow, methodical work. The photographs, the ledgers, the ships, the reactors, all pieces of a single lesson. That strength in the modern age belongs to those who can make thought tangible. As the last American transports departed and the bay returned to stillness, Japan faced not occupation, but instruction. Its leaders, stripped of myth, began to study the very system that had defeated them, rebuilding not in imitation, but in understanding. The old order, born of swords and banners, had been replaced by circuits, calculations, and cooperative will. And so we fade, not on explosions or parades, but on comprehension, on the quiet moment when a nation finally sees the shape of the world it once tried to defy. From here, the story must be told again. How illusions were engineered, how signals were buried, and how reality, patient and relentless, won.